Though we will celebrate it today, this Wednesday is actually Epiphany. It is the 12th day after Christmas and the traditional end of the Christmas season. Because we will have no services that day, we observe it today. Epiphany is the day when the church has traditionally celebrated the revelation of Christ to the world. According to Webster's dictionary, an epiphany is a manifestation of a divine being. When someone sees God, that is an epiphany. But an epiphany is also a sudden awareness of something. When the truth of something finally dawns on you, we call that an epiphany too. So on this day, we remember the Magi from the east and the story Matthew tells us of how they traveled from afar to worship the newborn king whose birth we celebrate at Christmas. It is the story of how these Gentiles, which is to say these non-Jews, came to see God revealed in the child and how they became aware of the truth of God's presence in their midst. It is a story of their epiphany and of ours. Now, no Christmas pageant would be complete without three actors in bathrobes and paper Burger King crowns presenting the infant Jesus with boxes wrapped in tinfoil or repurposed perfume bottles filled with colored water. But the story of the wise men does not actually occur on the night of Jesus' birth. It actually takes place sometime later. Matthew reports that the strangers from the east followed the star to the place where the child was. And in Matthew chapter 2, verse 11, we find that place is not a stable, it is a house. Epiphany, the celebration of the revealing of God to the world in Jesus Christ, therefore, takes place 12 days after Christmas to signify the length of time that had passed from his birth until the wise men finally did arrive. Now, most of what we know and remember about these three travelers comes from the Matthew story that we just read and from the Christmas carol, We Three Kings of Orient Are. This morning, we will sing that carol, but after each verse, we will receive part of the story as told by the Magi themselves. Now, we don't actually have records of these visitors, but many traditions have arisen over the years, and much scholarship has been undertaken to better understand who they were and what they did. So what you're about to hear is what one author imagines their stories to be. So I invite you to follow along with the story and to listen and sing as together we receive it anew.
Hello, my name is Melchior. I brought the gold to offer to the child. I came from the land of Persia. I was not a king, as your song suggests. None of us were, in fact. We sometimes advised kings. We sometimes advised those who struggled against kings. Maybe you'd call me a priest. Maybe you'd call me an astrologer. I spent my days studying the world and the stars, looking for signs about what would happen. For centuries, my ancestors have done just that. We believe that the sky gives us information about what's happening and what will happen both in our homeland and in places far away. It is one of the ways the Creator of the world speaks to us. Anyway, back to the story at hand. One night I was taking my regular readings of the sky when something highly unusual caught my eye, a new light in the sky. Quickly I consulted my charts and could find nothing explaining it. So I studied it closely. I watched how it interacted with other stars in the sky, and soon it was obvious to me that something spectacular was about to happen. The star signified a royal birth, and everything about it suggested it was to happen in the land of the Jews. I needed to learn more. As it happens, there's a tradition in my family that we have a connection to the people of Jerusalem. Many years ago, the Babylonians conquered that city and took captives. One of those was a young man named Daniel. He rose high in the esteem of the Babylonian royal court. Then, when my Persian ancestors conquered the Babylonians, this same Daniel moved into the service of the Persian king. It's a tradition in my family that Daniel was one of us, that he was in the same group of advisors that we are. For all I know, I could be one of his descendants. Because of this, we had in our records many writings from the Jewish land. I quickly consulted those to see what I could learn. At any rate, I quickly sent messages to my colleagues in other lands, telling them what I had seen and learned. Something this important required that we gave a reply of some sort. We had to go and see in person this thing that had happened. While I was waiting for an answer from my friends, I began to prepare for travel. A king had been born. I needed to take a proper gift, so I obtained a large casket of gold, a truly regal gift.
My name is Caspar, a scholar from one of the kingdoms in that part of the world you now call India. I brought frankincense to offer the child. Like my friend Melchior, I study the night skies for signs and warnings and news. When I too saw the strange new light in the sky, I wondered what it would be. As I am still young and inexperienced, I asked my mentors what they saw, but they had no idea what this new sign was. All they could tell me was that it was something of great importance. After asking every sage in the kingdom, I knew that I had only one other choice. To the west in Persia was Melchior, far older than I and much more learned. Quickly, I gathered my servants and a small armed escort and started on my way to consult with him. I had barely started out when a messenger from Melchior met me on the road. We made camp and shared a meal together. After the meal, I asked him what message he had brought with him. After I had heard it, I could not wait any longer. Early the next morning, we broke camp, and I hastened to meet with Melchior to discuss this news. When I arrived at his palace, I found him preparing to leave. After we had feasted together, I asked him to show me the old Jewish writings he had in his records. I spent an entire night and the whole next day poring over them, pausing only to compare my understandings with Melchior. What I found amazed me. That next night, Melchior and I went up to his observation gallery and watched the night sky again. The light had changed slightly. I looked at Melchior and said, "It is done. The child is born." Melchior said nothing, only nodded in agreement. While we watched, I took some more measurements and consulted the notes I had made. "There is more here than the birth of a king," I said. "My reading of these signs says that God has come to dwell on earth." At that very moment, we decided that we would leave the next day. So in the morning, we gathered our servants, and Melchior called on his apprentices to join us. And with a larger armed escort, we set out. As we traveled, we discussed what gifts would be most appropriate to take to the child. Knowing that many cultures burn incense in God's presence, I knew what I needed. And so, at the next city, I sent my most trusted servant out to buy a large quantity of frankincense, so to honor the child who was God in human form.
My name is Balthazar. I come from Arabia and brought myrrh to lay at the feet of the child. When the first messenger from Melchior arrived, I was stunned. How could I have missed such a sign? How could I have not heard about such things happening in the land of my brothers? For we are brothers, you know, we Arabs and the Jews. We in Arabia count ourselves as the descendants of Ishmael, the firstborn of Abraham, the eldest brother of Isaac. But alas, from the time of our shared ancestor, we have been at odds with our brothers. But I digress. I spent many hours mulling over the message I had received, wondering what it might mean. I searched the writings we had in our records. I stared at the night sky. I spent time in deep motivation. What should I do? Then a second messenger came. Melchior had been joined by Caspar from farther east. They were certain that the child was born. Even more, they were sure it was more than the human king that had been born, that God had come to the earth. I resolved then and there to join them in their quest to see the child, and so I gathered my own servants and a small escort and went to meet them on the road. In addition to my scholarship, I have been blessed with the gift of interpreting dreams. And it was a dream that influenced my choice of gift. My heart carried deep foreboding that this child would someday be killed. So I gathered together a large supply of myrrh, a burial spice. After I joined my fellow travelers, we continued to the most logical place to go looking for a new king of the Jews. We went to Jerusalem. We were quite a large entourage by this time, and with many armed men as an escort. The people around the king were clearly unsure of what to make of us. While we were there, our compatriots, men who also studied the ancient writings and signs of the times, looked into their traditions and told us we were close to our goal. Bethlehem was where we wanted to be. And so it was that we took our leave of the Jewish king and finished our journey. After we had paid our homage to the child and presented our gifts, we made ready to return to our homes, and Melchior and Caspar had promised the Jewish king that we would tell him where the child was to be found. Foolish men. They had obviously not heard about Herod. In Arabia, we had heard about how jealous and violent and murderous he was. Then I was warned in a dream. If we told Herod where the child was, that child would die. So once I told this to my fellows, the choice was obvious. We bypassed Jerusalem and went home by a different road. Strangely, many years later, I heard stories about a preacher who was thought to be God in human form. He was executed by his followers, but his followers claimed that he had risen from the dead. As I investigated the stories, I am sure that this man, Jesus, was the same child that we had visited all those years before. Of him it was said that once people met him, they could not follow the same path any longer. They too had to follow a different road.
Another Christmas has come and gone. We've put away the decorations and taken down the trees, or if you haven't, you probably will very soon. Our lives go on, and the memory of this season may dim. But what should stay with us is the journey of the Magi, who did not just see the light, but who followed it. And when they had found the Christ child to which it led them, bowed to him in worship and paid him homage. The legacy of this season should be lives lived in worship and total submission to Christ. But not for what we can get out of the deal. The Magi do not set out for Bethlehem in hopes of receiving some great reward or of cementing for themselves a place of prominence in the realm of the newborn king. No, the primary reason for their being there, the reason they embark on this journey from the very beginning, is to surrender themselves to worship Christ, which is a little bit frightening when you think about it. We like to think about God in terms of blessings and gifts received. We like to talk about God's grace and mercy and steadfast love. We like to celebrate the goodness of God and the blessings with which God has filled our lives to overflowing. But making ourselves subject to God means not just receiving God's gifts. It also means being subject to God's will and going wherever we are called. In the Monty Python film Life of Brian, we find the story of a boy who was born just a few doors down from Jesus on that same Christmas night. In the movie, the Magi initially go to the wrong address and find not Jesus, but the infant Brian. When they present his mother with their gifts, she replies, "Thanks a lot for the gold and the frankincense, but don't worry too much about the myrrh next time, okay?" And that's a little bit like how we approach Christmas. We want to pick and choose. Thank you, God, for the unconditional love. Thank you, God, for the salvation. But maybe not so much with the obligations and the responsibilities next time, okay? The story of the Magi reminds us that while Christ's birth was a great gift to us, it is also an invitation to follow, an invitation to worship, an invitation to sacrifice, an invitation to serve, an invitation to love, an invitation to walk down another road.